right now. Welcome to another expert interview with the Traffic Manual. Today I'm here with Kurt Elster of Ethercycle to chat about getting over the fear of podcasting. Kurt, tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm Kurt Elster. I'm the host of the unofficial Shopify podcast. I run an agency called Ethercycle. In the last year, I've discovered I've authored a ton of stuff, and between my own podcast and guesting, I have been on at least between 50 and 60 podcasts as the time of this recording.
Wow.
And the important note there, though, is that at least the first 10 terrified me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, I was sweating thinking about the first 2 for sure.
Mm-hmm. And, like, even to go back a year, you had barely even scratched the surface of podcasting. Like, tell us a bit about that origin story where you were a year and a half ago.
So, yeah, probably, I think maybe 18 months ago, I think it was you appeared on a podcast and were like, well, do you want an introduction? Mm-hmm. I never wanted to turn down an opportunity, just said yes. And I just assumed like no one would want to talk to me. And to my shock, they're like, yeah, not only did they say yes, that they were excited about it. So, mm-hmm. Okay. And we worked out the topic, and at that point, I was like, oh, fuck, I did not expect them to actually say yes.
Which can be the scariest part, like once you get that confirmation and, oh, it's suddenly a thing.
Yeah, and asking and getting the introduction and reaching out, like that's the hard part at first until you get someone to say, because it's easy. Well, you could make it easy by telling yourself like no one cares about me. This will be easy, because everyone's gonna say no and I can handle the rejection, and then they say yes. That's a new kind of fear.
Tell me about the fear. Elaborate on it a bit. Like, what was it like the first time you went on?
So it's essentially like the fear of, it comes from the fear of public speaking. Mm-hmm. Which is silly because it's not. You're not doing it live, and you're not doing it in front of people. You're doing it wherever you want to. You could do it in the comfort of your own home. The first one I recorded happened to be on a Sunday night, so I did it from my couch, which was great. And I was also worried about like the hardware. Well, we know all these things just happen over Skype, so if you've placed a Skype call, you already know how to do it. Mm-hmm. I used like a $30 microphone with headphones plugged into it, and that was it. Mm-hmm. But I was scared, so I had like talking points worked up. I had, that came from not being confident. I was sweating, I was nervous, and I had, for sure, I know I did like 2 shots of whiskey to try and get over the nerves. Mm-hmm. And then that became like a thing. Every time I guested on a podcast, I would do 2 shots of whiskey every time until it was like a habit. And that was at least the first 10 episodes where I was a guest. And that was the interesting thing is once you get on one, people may reach out to you and say, hey, do you want to appear on a podcast? Because no matter how nervous I was, other people weren't picking up on it, which, is always very surprising to you when you're the one experiencing it. And the same with, getting over my fear of public speaking, which is its own thing. But yeah, I mean, if you're frightened of public speaking, you're right to be scared of podcasts, either as a host or a guest. But as a guest, I mean, really all you're doing is it's no different than a phone call. Mm-hmm. Like, this isn't live radio or TV. If you screw it up, they'll start over or edit it out. It's not a big deal. It's not the same thing at all.
I've probably been on a dozen podcast episodes where the host, or on a guest on a dozen podcast episodes where the host flubs the introduction, flubs a question. It's just like, okay, hold on, back up. We're going to restart over. We might be like 10 or 20 seconds into discussing something, and they're the one who makes a mistake, and they're like, whoa, hold up. Scratch it, redo it. And it's natural for there to be flub-ups or mistakes. And when those happen, well, you back up and start over.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. You just have to – actually, the only thing to be mindful of is leave enough pause in there that it's easy for someone to edit. Don't just talk continuously. And you want to – probably a good tip in there is to – if you're nervous, you're going to talk a lot. It'll make you kind of ramble. Stop so that you can pause, take a breath, and that will make it easier to edit, but it'll also give the podcast host an easy opportunity to jump in, assist you, change topic, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the public speaking tips I was told years and years ago was always, you're going to be nervous when you get on stage or get in front of people. The adrenaline's going to hit you, so you're going to start talking a mile a minute and going to speed up, and you're going to go through a 10 or 20-minute presentation in 5 minutes. So you want to almost talk uncomfortably slow, like slow it down to the point where you feel like I'm very relaxed right now. And that's going to be the correct cadence. That's going to be the correct speed for editing or for you to not be talking a mile a minute.
Well, and an interesting point there is, when you talk, if you talk slowly and calmly to someone, it they can't help but find you more persuasive and calming in the process. It's hard to listen to someone who's clearly nervous. So rather than be like, it's easy. Just slow down. Like the reason you're stumbling over your words is because you're talking too quickly. So if you force yourself to slow down, yeah, that really helps a lot. Unless you're excited and you're happy to be there, that's different.
Right. Yeah, and there's a balance of it, but I think one major takeaway there is, I guess two major takeaways are, when you're getting started, you might be a little nervous, and that's okay, but it's important to keep in mind that this is just a phone call. I mean, if you're a consultant... Oh, please.
Yeah. No, I always tell, with guests on my own show now, and hosting it, like, you really want to ratchet things up. Hosting your own show is like twice as nerve-wracking, because you're trying to listen attentively and think of the next thing and watch the clock. Like, that's its own separate set of skills. So I definitely, I know some people get into podcasting by starting their own podcast. I'd probably stick with, I'd say guesting is easier before hosting, at least in my experience anyway. And, but no, what I tell guests now is, and part of this is the format of the show, is, okay, we're two people having a conversation in a cafe, and the audience is just happens to be lucky enough to be listening in to two smart people at the table next to us. And when you look at it that way, it's a lot, you're not talking to or for the audience. It's a lot less scary. And that's what's interesting to people. You want to hear, two people having a conversation that produces insights. Like, listen to, actually what helped a lot, I have Sirius in my car. And I was listening to Howard Stern, and he does these, think what you want about him, but his interviewing style and interviews are phenomenal. And I started like really paying attention to it, and I realized, when he interviews someone, he'll match like everything about them. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but he'll match like their language, their cadence, all of it. And just really is just always kind of asking them the next question, the next logical question to whatever the conversation is. And you could prepare talking points, like one quick tip, it's helpful. You can also make yourself less nervous. A couple times I have sent, when pitching podcast hosts to have me, I will send them, I did this with Bryce Bladen of Clients from Hell. I was like, hey, here's 3 sample Q&A. Where I was literally like, this is the question you can ask me, this is the answer I will give you. To give him an idea that I'm prepared, this is what to do. But of course, like, coming at it from a host, it's tough to think of questions sometimes. So it's helpful just to have some in your back pocket so you don't have those awkward pauses. And sure enough, like on the podcast, I know he asked me at least 2 of them. And I hit, like, it was, we booked it like a month prior, so I'd forgotten about it, but boom, he asks it and it immediately prompts me, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and in a way, it makes it easier for you to get over the fear if you're like, okay, here's like 3 or 5 questions that relate to my pitch or relate to my area of expertise that you could ask me. And it makes it easier for the host because they know, oh, sweet, I know the questions to ask Kurt. I know that the guest has prepared enough to know what kind of questions the audience is going to be curious about. And suddenly you're helping each other do each other's jobs better. It's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. And I think people need to realize, like, if your fear isn't, step 1 is to get on a podcast, right?
Right.
So if you know someone who is hosting a podcast, ask them, because you're going to be relaxed talking to a friend. If you know someone who's been on a podcast, ask them for an introduction. That's, I think, how most of us did it. But if not, you just have to cold pitch someone. And it's the easiest thing to make your pitch work is to offer topics. And if you show up as like, hey, I'm a prepared guest, and here are 1, 2, or 3 topics that I could talk to you on, that makes the host's life so much easier. For me as a host, the worst thing is when someone's like, oh, I'd love to be a guest on your show, and I say yes, and they say, okay, what's the topic? I'm like, yeah, you tell me. What
You're the expert.
And I think they're like, and I get that they're trying to, they're not being lazy. It's an act of deference where they're saying, well, this is your show, this is your sandbox, what shall we discuss? And it's like, no. Just tell me what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, what can you as the guest bring to the table for the audience? What do you have that's relevant and interesting?
So in that situation, it is very advantageous for everybody for you to be assertive and say, I would like to come on your show. I think I'd be a good guest. Here's why. and here's the topics I could speak to.
Mm-hmm.
Be assertive. Like that's the kind of thing that when you're booking guests for a show, you appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
yeah. Go ahead.
No, it gives you as the host a lifeline where the guest is able to say, hey, these are the 3 topics I could talk about. And, well, great. Now it's almost like pitching in a consulting work. You're offering the host a choice of yeses instead of the host going, I guess I have to decide if I have this person on or not. It's I get to decide which topic to have the guest on to talk about.
Yeah, and you almost have to treat, like, when I do the topics, when I'm pitching them, I don't write them I write them as the same way I'd write a headline. Like, I need them to be enticing and interesting. And I'm giving the person the easy out. Like, oh, if you're going to use this on your show, here's the headline you could use for the episode.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't say that, but it's like, you already have that. When you see it, you can't help but think like, oh, man, that would make a good episode title.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what was it that changed after 10 or so episodes where it became easier? Was it a mind shift? Was it just it becoming something more natural, something else?
So what happened was, so what I was doing was jumping from, like, I quickly figured out the talking points that worked for me. And those have changed over time, and they will. But once I worked out the talking points, it was easy because someone would ask a question, and I would just launch into, it was almost like muscle memory, where it's this anecdote, the story cold.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, how did you get into consulting? Well, you tell your 2-3 minute thing, and they're like, oh, that's interesting. And there's kind of like a natural next question that you're probably already prepared for at that point. So once you have that set of talking points, it's easy. That's one way to do it. If you're, say, like, you're telling a story, and you'll catch this if you start, like, let's say you see someone who's promoting a movie. Like, I saw Vin Diesel promote, I don't know what movie, but he's told the same. I just happened to catch him on several interview shows, and he told exactly the same anecdote, the same, like, funny story about me gaining weight eating ice cream. He had to gain 30 pounds for some role, and it was literally the exact same anecdote with delivery every single time.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether, like, a lot of actors get nervous in that same situation because this isn't filming, this is live now, and they have the same talking points. Like, that's all it was.
Yep.
The other thing is just being comfortable in your material, and that comes with practice. Because I've spoken with, I spoke with a woman who's incredibly smart, really talented, great copywriter, and even though she was so comfortable with the material, the podcast ended up being unusable because she was too nervous.
Oh my.
Yeah, so it's so in her case, she would have really benefited from, like, I have talking points prepared, and here are questions to ask me, and then I could just run through it, give my stuff with it, and go. Like, that's one way to tackle it. But you could when you have talking points, you could think of it like a speech. If you've practiced it, it'll just come out naturally.
Mm-hmm.
But number one, like, break that mindset of this is public speaking. It is absolutely the furthest thing from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. One of the things I recommend in the traffic manual is on the topic of talking points, having just a note card with like 5 bullets of things that you want to touch on during the conversation. And it might be talk about my new offering, talk about an article I released, call to action to join my email course, but just so as you go through the interview, it's easy for you to say, oh, okay, great. I want to make sure I mention this thing. I'll work it into my topic. And it gives you a framework to move through instead of feeling like you're out there, let's see what the host throws at me. You at least have the topic that you've given the host, the topic you've agreed on, some questions you've exchanged, and the points you want to hit. So you now have a framework for the interview itself.
Yeah, no, and it's perfectly fine to have, like, to write down sound bites in there. But no, whenever I do any of these, I have with me my tools, which are just a legal pad and a pen. And that way, if the host is talking, I can write down, like, oh, mention this thing, and write it down so that, when I'm on the spot, I don't panic.
Mm-hmm.
And when hosting, initially I would like print out sound bites, like quotes that I could read. And even in hosting my own podcast, just so they sound smooth for the intro, outro, I just have it on the screen written out.
Oh, perfect.
Because then I know I'm going to read it smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of... So for somebody who's listening to podcasts saying, oh, the people always sound so prepared and perfect, this is going to be my first podcast, I know I feel that. Yeah, it's been edited, they have sound bites, they've prepared, they're telling the same... Like, I know for a fact, like, I've told the same origin story of how I became a consultant 25 times across different podcasts.
Cold now.
Right. And on a podcast somebody listens to that I record today, they'll be like, oh man, he whipped that out like that. But if you go back 2 years ago, it's going to be rougher. It's going to be different. It's going to be a little more fluid.
Absolutely. Probably like if you're going to go on a podcast, no matter what, they're going to ask you to introduce yourself. Mm-hmm. So that's like soundbite number 1. Have that ready, is so that you just don't. They're like, all right, and joining us now is Kai Davis. Kai, tell us about yourself, and then you just go, have your positioning statement ready, just 1 or 2 sentences about who you are, so that you can rattle off your elevator pitch essentially, and that's going to also determine whether or not people keep listening to the episode. This is PR. You want people to listen to your episode, so throw that out there. Have maybe an anecdote ready, the topic, so like just have 3 tips or stories on there. And then I always try and close, like, you want to give people actionable advice. So, maybe you're plugging something, maybe there's a tip. I always try to have, like, my tip and my plug ready at the end.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about, like, a podcast as a unit or as an object, one realization I've had recently is if you're able to leave the audience just one step better off than they were when they started listening to the episode, one tip, one actionable piece of advice, one strategy they could follow today in their business, it's valuable for them. In 30 minutes, I learned something that's going to help me be a better business owner. Great. That's worth it. And so it doesn't need to be all that you know about a topic. Like you work in e-commerce. It would be impossible for you to share everything you know about e-commerce in a 30-minute interview. But you could share, like, great, here's 2 tips for improving your store's conversion rate. And any listener will be like, oh, man, this is wonderful. I now know 2 things I can do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's kind of funny. I actually now, with experience, I prefer that Q&A format where either, like, let's say I host a webinar and people just ask questions and I throw out the answers. Like, I like that. Mm-hmm. I'm comfortable with that now because I don't, I can work quickly on my toes and think through it and give you, fluid answers versus there is a single episode that's me doing a monologue, and it came out fine. It was good. But Paul Rita, who produces the show, he was like, he goes, on a waveform, I can literally recognize the sound of you saying because of the monologue.
That's fascinating. And so, like, did that nudge you to eliminate that from your vocabulary or nudge you away from that format of an episode?
I still like that format. Monologue's the hardest thing you can do, I think. Mm-hmm. Actors knew that. I did not until I attempted it myself. But it's low pressure. It's just you and the microphone by yourself, and you record it and then edit it down. But for that, for me anyway, to make a monologue work, I can't be reading it.
Right.
I could write the script in advance and practice it, but once it comes time to actually record it, it has to go away because no one wants to listen to a dramatic reading.
Which is interesting, since I know there are a couple of very popular podcasts. Tim Ferriss's comes to mind, where a few episodes are him doing dramatic readings of old articles or blog posts or content that he's produced in the written form and now is sharing in audio form.
I would guess that he has, I don't know if he reads his own audiobook, but I assume, like, going through something like that, you probably gain. I'm sure there's a way to do it right.
Sure.
Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And I don't know how.
Right. Sure.
So I avoid that format. But yeah, no, podcasting, I mean, it's really, if you're like a charismatic, easygoing person in social situations and you're not afraid of public speaking, you're okay. Just go. You've already got it all. Go. Whereas, I was more introverted, and it turned, I was able to get over that. And then, I had to get over my fear of public speaking, which I felt like once I had accepted that podcasts weren't public speaking, when it came time to actually do a speech, come last September, still terrifying. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, once I did it, I realized, like, all those skills I built up with the podcast were so invaluable. Mm-hmm. Once I got over the fear and did my first speech, now, I was able to do another one impromptu, and that was, like, no big deal.
Right. But it's almost like podcasting was a way for you to exercise the muscle of speaking and get over that fear, and then you were in a situation that was different and uncomfortable, giving a presentation at Double Your Freelancing conference this past September, and while going into it, it felt like, this is an unfamiliar situation. It's the same skills. You're talking, you're presenting, you're talking about your expertise.
Yeah, once I, with podcasting, I had to do like, let's say 10 episodes before I was really comfortable with it as a guest. And then 10, probably like, 10, 15 episodes as a host before I really nailed the format and got it right. Whereas public speaking, I just had to get through one speech successfully for me to discover, oh, okay, all those skills, they apply here. And now, I don't have that fear of public speaking. So in that sense, podcasting is it's a great way to get over, to practice. It's the softball version of public speaking.
Right. Yeah, and I've always been amazed how, like when you get started with it, you alluded to this earlier, that one of the main challenges is getting that first podcast interview. Like leveling up from I have 0 to 1 is the biggest leap you could make, and then 1 to 2 is a bit easier. But once you get that first one, you're starting to practice, you're starting to experience it, you're more in the environment, and it becomes easier to get the future ones.
Yeah, and even today, now that I have, I'm promoting my own stuff, and I'm now I find myself using the email templates from the traffic manual. Mm-hmm. They're phenomenal. But I rewrote those, in my own voice a little bit. I just used it to get, 2 guest blog posts. And now I'm about to head back out onto the podcast guesting circuit, as it were.
Mm-hmm. So talking about the podcast guesting circuit for a bit, previously you'd been using podcast guesting to promote yourself, your brand, and your agency.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about what the results were like there. How has podcasting influenced, has there been a return for you on it? Okay.
So this is what's interesting about podcasting. Even if you're not, even if the audience isn't quite the right fit, it's still worthwhile. Because it's great SEO. It produces these evergreen backlinks and traffic sources. Like, it is amazing to me how often people will reach out and be like, "Oh yeah, I heard you on X podcast," and it will be an episode that was recorded over 12 months ago, because they Googled it and it popped up as a relevant thing, so they listened to it. Mm-hmm. What's so powerful about podcasting, though, is they'll email me and say, "Well, let's schedule a call," assuming it's a reasonable thing. And now, even though I'm promoting like Shopify services, it just creates this incredible word of mouth thing going. And people have this idea that, oh, if you're a guest on a podcast, it's like being a guest on the Today Show, and that you must have been vetted in some way and know what you're doing, and clearly you're a big shot. No. it isn't, it isn't the case, but they don't. But anyway, so, there's more deference, there's more respect. They could sense that you're an expert or authority when they reach out to you. So it's very, they reach out to you, and then I say, okay, well, let's schedule a call. Schedule the call, get on the phone call, and this happens every time. About halfway through the phone call, they say, I feel like I know you. So, yeah? And I said, yeah, because I listened to you, I listened to that podcast episode, and then I listened to more episodes, and I'd recognize, if you called me out of the blue, I'd recognize your voice.
Oh, my.
Like, it's a very personal medium, and it's not like I'm giving like 4-hour podcast episodes. My own podcast, and a typical podcast is 20 to 30 minutes. It's like a TV show, but people are listening to it in the car, or working out, or at work on headphones, and they have you in their ear. So it and I had to even get over, like, I hated the sound of my own voice. I couldn't even listen to podcasts that I was in. And you just get over it. And I think actually, having the headphones on, the feedback, I know for sure I speak differently on podcasts than I do, like, just, with friends. And I no longer have any control over that. Like, totally involuntary. It just happens. And I had a podcast guest recently admit to me that she took voice lessons.
Oh, wow. Good.
Yeah. To like master that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely a next level strategy that people could use. Working with a voice coach, taking voice lessons, joining Toastmasters, taking speaking lessons to get more comfortable with that process.
I haven't done any of that. I suspect anyway, and a few friends have confirmed it for me. Just that on a podcast I talk differently. Mm-hmm. Well, we're friends in real life. I talk differently right now than I would if we were just on the phone.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I have no control over that.
Right. No, and I think it's the same for me. I definitely slip into an interviewee format when I'm a guest on a podcast, making sure that I'm talking in 10 to 15 second segments, making sure that I'm coming up for air when I'm talking with the host, making sure that I'm wrapping everything up. I always like the idea of a concluding sentence to a thought where it's like, okay, and like in conclusion, I touched on A, B, and C as 3 strategies to grow your traffic. And I wouldn't do that in real life, but I want to make it easy for a listener who's listening to that episode to tune back in and be like, oh, okay, he was saying these 3 things, and now the host has a jumping off point. So
that's smart.
Yeah, it's fitting how I present to fit the medium.
I'll do that if I lose my train of thought,
mm-hmm.
and I don't want to just be, sitting with dead air or going, so I will recap what I just said.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, where was I? And then I'll recap what I said. But I've never thought of just using it as like part of the format. That's smart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even going a step further and saying things like, you do that wrap up and be like A, B, and C, and then saying, let's dive into topic 2. Like, what experience do you, the host, have with topic 2? And then turning it from like an interrogation format, which is what I feel a lot of people can feel podcasts can be like. I am there and being bombarded with questions too.
Yeah, it's
a conversation.
Yes, and that's what makes it scary. It feels like it's a recorded live job interview.
Right.
You don't want that nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I used to coach my friends on job interviews, I said the number one most valuable thing you could do is start asking them questions. Don't just be there like, okay, I'm ready for you to pepper me with questions. Be like, I did some research and I had a couple questions for you. And it changes the energy.
I was going to say, how awkward is it if I answer a phone call from my dentist, but they hung up, so we're good.
But let me take a look at my notes for a second. So nowadays, how do you prepare for a podcast interview? You have one coming up in 2 weeks. You've decided on the topic. What steps do you take to get ready?
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, so I would. This is why. That sounds crazy, but I would, when I go seeking out podcast opportunities, I know what I'm trying to pitch and what I'm trying to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would never pitch a topic that I'm not comfortable on anymore. I'm like have a clear niche and expert, authority status with Shopify and like very specific areas in it. So that's the only thing I would agree to be on.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say yes to an opportunity where I'm not comfortable. So at this point, I no longer have to do any preparation.
Mm-hmm.
Just show up and go. Done. What do you want to talk about? All right, I'll talk about that.
Right.
But in the past, I would same deal where I would I'd run through some of their past shows with similar guests. You don't necessarily have to listen to all of them, but check the notes are, see what they were what the format was like, what they were doing. Obviously being proactive and asking the host, hey, do you have any steps? Is there anything I need to go through? Anything I need to do? And often they will, and they appreciate that. But probably the easiest thing that I wish everyone would do is, when you open that call, when you start talking to the host, say, hey, what did you want to cover? What did you want to get out of this? Straight up ask them, and they will tell you like if there's some agenda that they're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're aware of it and can work with it, versus like during the recording where they're like clearly trying to steer you in a direction and you don't know what that direction is.
I've experienced both sides of that, where I've been the guest who hasn't asked that question and the host is like, I really want to talk about SEO in this direction, and it gets challenging, versus when the host is like, I really want to like hit these 3 points in our conversation. It's like, okay, perfect. I know where the marks are. I know where we're moving towards.
Yeah. I mean, that's so oftentimes like if I could sense the person is nervous or, I just want to make my life easy, I will say, okay, what topics do we want to hit? Okay, so here's the questions I'm going to ask you, and like run it through them in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So like here's the 5 questions, and then we'll just anything in between there is just natural conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are very easy ways to steer it to make life easy.
Right. What about like calls to action at the end of the interview? What do you promote now? What have you promoted in the past? And how do you decide what to promote?
So you need to make it something easy, and it has to be free. You're not gonna sell anyone anything immediately from the as a call to action at the end. So really, I mean, probably number one, you want to use it as a list building strategy. Ideally, you have a lead magnet. If you want to be lazy, just be like our Facebook page. Just give them something where they can go from their phone, because that's probably where they're listening to this, and subscribe to you in some way. That might be Twitter or Facebook. But hopefully it's an email list, and if you're doing that, then ideally you can give them some lead magnet.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're promoting a book, would be a good example. To download a free sample chapter of my book and receive updates, about my life and my funny anecdotes, head to kurtelster.com and subscribe. Like, you just give them something, ideally that's easy to remember. And then when you follow up with the host, make sure you send them, here's my bio. And writing show notes is a pain, so they will just copy and paste it, and include the link in there and say, hey, here's the links we talked about. Anything you can do to make the host isn't lazy, but it's a lot of work, to write that stuff. And it's often hard to remember when you're if you've recorded 3 shows in a week. Wait, what did I talk about on which one? So if you just give them, hey, here's the links we talked about, here's my bio, here's your show notes, they will just copy and paste it most of the time.
Yeah.
I know this because I will just copy and paste it most of the time.
For a few of my clients, I manage the booking of their podcast guests. And what I've ended up doing is just setting up an onboarding form where I'm like, hey, we're so excited to have you on for the interview. Here's the form. Fill it out. That's the next step. And it's like name, email, show notes link, headshot, your bio, your URL. And it makes it easy for us since it's like, hey, great, this is exactly what we need. And it makes it easy for them since they're able to sit down and in 5 minutes be like, okay, cool. I filled out every single question you've asked me. Now we're able to proceed forward with the interview. And so using strategies like that from the host side, and I think even applying it just from the guest perspective, like you're saying, when you take the initiative, when you're more assertive and say, here's the info, here's the show notes, here's my headshot, now it's even easier for the host to say, okay, great, episode's done, we could ship it.
Yeah, when I promote if I were to try to pitch myself on a podcast right now, I would say, hey, I'd love to come on your show to talk about X topic. I host my own show, and I know what a pain it could be to book guests. So I promise I come with a good microphone, and I wear headphones, which, it makes, if you don't do that, editing a show is very hard. So throwing that in there is like a funny way of saying, I get you, like I'm one of you. And I will often say, like, if someone asks, reaches out to me and says, hey, can I be in your podcast? I'm like, sure, here's a link to my bio with my headshot, and you can just pull all the information you want out of there. And I've made it so easy for them.
Yeah, in a sense, and I've talked about this in a couple other of these expert interviews, it comes down to lowering the perceived risk for the host. If the host feels like, this person's going to be a pain or it's going to be risky to have them on, it's a higher chance of getting a no. If you instead make it so it's an easy no-brainer decision to have you on as a guest, well, great. Then it's a no-brainer decision to have you on as a guest.
Yeah. Yeah, you just want to make it like any barrier to entry, remove it. So, writing the show notes. All right, take that out. Making sure the call quality is decent. Take that out. Making sure that you're a decent speaker. Well, you take that out by including, if you can, obviously you can't do this with the first one, but an example to, here's an episode I was on. And then, of course, here's a link to my headshot and my bio. Like, you just made it so easy to, like, why would I say no to someone who comes with all of those things? So when I reach out, I do the same thing.
Yep. No, you're absolutely spot on there. Anything you can do that reduces that risk, that makes it easier to work with you. And even I found the host might not listen to the sample episode you send, but it's
the fact that you did it.
Yeah, it's social proof. It's like the MasterCard and Visa logo on a checkout form. Like, seeing it implies a sense of trust, or implies that this is a real thing. This is a business. You are a professional. You're ready to work together. Yeah,
that's what it comes to. Is just demonstrate that you're a professional. Can you string a sentence together in an email? Like, oh, thank God. You'd be surprised how many people can't write an email to save their lives. So if you send me an email that's like incoherent and poorly written, clearly you're not going to be able to speak well, so I'm not going to book you.
Right. Yeah, and I've been amazed how often I'll be on the pitching, the side getting pitched of the podcast, and like you alluded to earlier, it's somebody saying, hey, I'd love to be on the episode. End of email. And I'm like, well, great. Give me something to work with. What are topics? And like, it's a 4 or 5 email volley just to get there. Yep. And that becomes hard. Like, as the host, you as the guest want to think, what is the host going to be doing when they're trying to decide to have me on? And how can I make it so easy that they're just like, yes, of course, I want you as a guest. Done. Yeah. Anything else you'd want to add about the process you had getting comfortable with podcasting and leveling up from starting to hosting your own podcast and public speaking?
I would start with try and get on a podcast that a friend's been on. Because then it's so much easier. Just say, hey, can you introduce me? I'd love to do this. And you can also ask them, like, hey, how are they as a host? Did they make it easy? And that's going to get rid of some of your jitters, some of your fear. Because some hosts are better than others. It's true. And other than that, I mean, it's really, like, just as long as you stick to a topic you're comfortable with. So, like, a good beginning topic is probably yourself. You know, go with, like, hey, this is my journey. So let's say you're probably, you know, if you're listening to this, you're probably an entrepreneur of some kind, and you have some interest in promoting yourself. Make that the first thing you go out and try and pitch is like your origin story. Be like, hey, you know, this is my journey from quitting my job to opening my own business that makes 5 figures a month, which feels great, and I'm so impressed to have done it. I'd love to share that story with you on your show. I think it'll inspire your audience, and I've got a few tips, you know, mistakes I learned along the way. Like if I get so few store owners of Shopify stores reach out to me with that story, like with that pitch, where the few times I've gotten it, the answer is always yes, of course.
Right.
And it's such an easy thing to talk about. You're talking about yourself and your story and your own journey. Like so long as you're not lying, you're good to go.
But it becomes easy for you to talk about it. It becomes easy for the host to say, okay, I can see the value in this for my audience. And it becomes easy for the audience to say, oh, I want to hear somebody's hero's journey. I want to hear the narrative and take away the lessons I can from that.
And then, you know, if you do that, like after 3 times, then you'll have those talking points where you could just do this cold. And at the end of those, people will say, well, ask them, be like, hey, how'd I do? And they will tell you, well, they'll be honest. They'll be like, oh, you did great, and you should do more of these. And then they're likely to give you introductions to other ones, maybe even have you back as a repeat guest if you pitch them. Because getting good guests is hard. I had another point, and I don't remember what it was. Oh, so once you've done that, you know, you're comfortable with it, then you can move on to figuring out, okay, what am I an expert at? What topics do I want to discuss and pitch? Because at this point, like, you're comfortable with the format, and we can move on to more like genuine Q&A expert stuff. To get over that, you just have to kind of accept if there's a topic where you know 10% more than the listener, they will see you as an expert. All you have to do is leave them, you know, like you said, 10% better off than before they heard you. So, I mean, that's kind of how looking at it from, you know, where I am now, that's how I would tackle it. And that's how I basically tackled it, but without like any plan or anything like that.
No, it was the same for me as I got experience podcasting and then working with other people who either host or guest on podcasts. There wasn't so much a system as like, well, maybe let's try it this way. And looking back, I could see, well, there is a clear flow here. Like we start out, like you say, talk about your experience and your journey, and then we identify better topics that connect with the audience. And then now it's easier to appear. Now it's easier to pitch. Now you have a library of other podcast episodes you're able to reference. I think our mutual friend Jonathan Stark the other day pointed out, oh, he just hit like 20 podcasts that he's been on. And you have those up on a page on your site. That's a huge credibility boost. If you're able to link a host and say, hey, here's a list of the other episodes I've been on, I'd be happy to talk about any of these topics with you for your audience. The host is like, oh man, he knows or she knows what she's doing. Like she can do a good podcast episode. I'd love to have her on to talk about any of these.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, you know, a podcast, and often podcasts are labors of love. You know, they don't generate, most of the time they're not going to generate any real money on their own. You know, they're mostly for marketing and PR. So anything you could do to make it fast and easy for the host is what you should do.
That's perfect. Now I think we've tackled everything I wanted to and more. So Kurt, if people want to find out a little more about you, what should they do next?
Head to kurtelster.com, sign up for my newsletter there. At which point I will send you you'll probably get a weekly letter from me about each of my new podcast episodes.
Perfecto. Well, excellent. Well, hey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I know the audience is going to love this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.